think we will begin. Welcome everybody to tonight's event. My name is Christine Schmidt and I am the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London. On behalf of the library and as part of our new academic books event series, I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Andreas Kranebitter, who will speak about his new book, The Construction of Criminals, the Imprisonment of So-Called Professional Criminals in the Mauthausen Concentration Camp, which was published by New Academic Press this year. I will be putting a link to the book in the chat. It is currently in German and hopefully will be coming out in English before too long, but it is actually also freely available to download as an ebook, so I will be putting that link in shortly for your information. Dr. Kranebitter will be in conversation with Dr. Anna Hájková on this important and challenging topic that demands further research and attention, and therefore his book is a groundbreaking contribution to the field, and very much looking forward to hearing the conversation. Before I introduce our speakers and hand over to our chair, just a few notes of housekeeping. Our formal discussion for the evening between Drs. Kranebitter and Hájková will last about 40 to 45 minutes. And then there will be some time for questions and answers and comments from the audience. You'll be kept on mute throughout the entire event, but please post your questions in the chat directly to me, and I will feed them back to our speakers, and we can hopefully take up as many as we can. As I mentioned, you'll be on mute so that there aren't any unintended interruptions, but you can post your questions anytime. And please also note that you can turn on and off the automated captioning using the button at the bottom of your screen. Just remember that this is automated, so it doesn't always accurately reflect the words of the speaker. So now I'd like to turn to introduce our two eminent guests, one who is logging in from Vienna and one who is logging in from Ann Arbor, my old stomping ground. So welcome, Dr. Andreas Kranebitter. He is the director of the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance, the DÖV in Vienna, the author of 2 monographs and many studies. His theses were awarded the Herbert Steiner and the Irma Rosenberg prizes. He began his career at the Mauthausen Memorial, where he rose to the directorship of research. Most recently, he was director of the Archive of the History of Sociology in Austria at the University of Graz. I would also like to welcome Dr. Anna Hájková, who is reader of modern European continental history at the University of Warwick here in the UK, and the author of the celebrated monograph, The Last Ghetto, An Everyday History of Theresienstadt, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. She has been researching the life of Willy Brachmann, a Hamburg so-called criminal prisoner and survivor of Auschwitz, and lobbying for his commemoration. So I can't think of a better chair for tonight's event. So please, I would like to hand it over, the virtual floor over now to Anna.
Thank you so much, Christine. I'm very delighted that we can introduce this important and hotly anticipated book by my colleague and friend. I knew about Dr. Kranebitter's work and I was very eager to become acquainted with him. So I became his friend after knowing his work, and it's a beautiful day to introduce it. I need to start with a trigger warning. We will be using some extremely racist Nazi language. Terms such as a social or habitual criminals are, of course, very oppressive language. But in order to facilitate the flow and to also because this is an academic book, we will drop the quotation marks, but please bear them in mind. As many of the people in the audience know, that discussing the so-called habitual criminals was one of the last thresholds in research, akin to Sinti and Roma, about whom Ari Joskovich wrote his very important book that was also introduced at the Wiener Library, or the same-sex desire in the Holocaust, about which I work. This is one of the most stigmatized topics, group that was denied reparations, group that was seen as kind of the absolute rubbish that did not deserve a history that's starting to change, but there is still resistance. This is still a political topic, something that we will touch on. And I am really hopeful that this seminal book will come out in English in the next 5 years or so. So Andreas and I will discuss something like 6 questions, and then we will open it up. And I want to start with a clear questions. Andy, who were the so-called habitual criminals, and how did they get into the concentration camps?
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna, for organizing it, and thank you, Christine, also for inviting me, and thank you all for your interest in this topic and in this book. also, it's very important for me to underline what you said, that it's a derogatory language. So it's tough to write a book about this with very much Nazi language in German. It's even tougher to translate it into English. It was not easy to prepare this. It's the first book presentation in English, hopefully not the last, since we're trying to translate it into English, but please be patient also if I don't find the right words for this. Well, this question is, of course, the bigger question of how the Nazis dealt with crime and what they even understood and perceived as crime and criminals. And this is a long story, even not only in Germany, but in international criminology. If you follow, and this is the only name I'm going to mention, Michel Foucault in the bigger picture here, it's quite clear that you have over decades and centuries a long history of thinking about crime. And in the 18th century, it started with focusing on the offense itself. Everybody could commit a crime at each time, and criminal law focused on the offense. And in the 19th century, after the revolutions and with the dialectic of enlightenment, actually crimes started to be something that was not one offense by one offender, but it was something that a typical group of offender would do. So this disciplines and the science would only have to identify those offenders, and it's a criminal law of focusing on the offender and not on the offense anymore. So meaning that people doesn't act as he does or as she does out of a free will, but because he or she is determined by something, be it the genes, the hereditary genes, be it a sociological, a psychological, a medical cause, but there is a cause to it. And since he or she is not responsible for it, we just have to find, this is the idea, and identify this group of incorrigible criminals and lock them away. So this was basically part of the discourse in the 19th century and the early 20th century, but it was more or less a theoretical issue and not a practical one. So even though theory and criminology was already talking about indeterminate imprisonment, hardly any cases were done, especially in Austria and Germany, where there were no penal colonies and so on. So when the Nazis came to power in 1933, one of the first things that they made is to introduce such a preventive custody by courts, meaning that someone identified as a born criminal or as as an incorrigible criminal could be sentenced indeterminately after his sentence to so-and-so. What is new in Nazi Germany as well is that it's not only the courts doing this, but also the police. And this is where we are talking about concentration camps. It's not even waiting for someone to commit any crime or to do anything, to act on an offense, but just to have proven by your previous convictions that you are a Berufsverbrecher, a professional criminal. So the thing was so they were actually talking about 3 previous crimes of 6 months sentence or more than that. And that made you actually proving that you would have been a professional criminal and outlawed everyone with 3 convictions. So the criminal police could take you into preventive custody. It's actually a very easy and very banal criminological theory of people who are responsible for the major part of crime in a society would be professional criminals. You could ignore all those, would be Gelegenheitsverbrecher, occasional criminals, in a very binary thinking way of people responsible for the main part of crime in a society, which is, of course, an illusion. The second part of this Nazi illusion is the illusion of feasibility, as Patrick Wagner has called it, by social engineering, so that you can identify this group and eradicate crime once you have identified it by deporting those criminals to concentration camps. Of course, this is impossible to solve by this, and this means that if you can't solve crime by this, you have to act even harsher and harsher. So this is a radicalization program in itself, an inherent one. So what it is basically also is that the criminal police was, of course, not acting by itself and alone in space. But of course, it was based within the society. So what we're writing here is the history of society in National Socialism, because it was an empowerment of police agencies, of local actors, of welfare agencies, of employers, of neighbors, to denounce anyone they would they would call antisocial or asocial, or who had previous conviction, and have the police take him into preventive custody. And what we also have to see is that this is a very big promise of security for the bigger part of society without previous convictions, even though we're talking about the 20s and 30s. So previous convictions are not, quite often to find. But the majority of Germans and Austrians were enthusiastic about this idea of fighting crime and cleaning society with this promise of security. And the radicalization program meant that first they were talking about the permanent exclusion and deportation to concentration camps, and second they were talking about the extermination program, and in this case very, very openly, of extermination through work, which is very specifically connected to the history of the Mauthausen concentration camp. I forgot to share my screen and to show you one of the things that I was talking about. This is, of course, the idea of criminality being linked to certain people, to underworld of genes, as they called it, being able to be identified. So this is from the 19th century, the Viennese criminal album, as they called it. But of course, this idea, this older idea of the 19th century, that people are identifiable as incorrigible criminals, physiognomic, well, I'm sorry, I missed the words in English, by their appearance, is of course older, but was radicalized and politicized in National Socialism. In terms of the Mauthausen concentration camp, we're talking about a group of 4,000 people that were labeled professional criminals. 885 of them were Austrians, and I focused mainly on them because it's of course easier to find criminal records and to find sources on this even big group still. But of course, we're talking about the concentration camp of nearly 200,000, so 190,000 people who were deported there and 90,000 who died there. But of those 4,000, even 40% of those professional criminals died. So for me, to focus on this group was not to fill one of the last research gaps, but to really look at the Mauthausen concentration camp history from another perspective, and also to look on the National Socialist state in Austria as well as Germany from a social history point of view, and to write this history from below. So the essential thing for this first question, and sorry, I'm stopping here, is really to say that those who were deported as professional criminals to a concentration camp were not sentenced by any court to a concentration camp. But this is so necessary to really to underline this, because even in research, people are not really thoroughly understanding this sometimes. But they were sent there by a police without having committed any kind of crime or offense. So they have just had previous convictions, and because of their previous convictions, which they had been sentenced to, and they had been in prison for this and had been released, because of these previous convictions, they were labeled as born criminals, as professional criminals, and sent to concentration camps.
Okay, thank you. Can you maybe stop sharing?
Sure, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. What I want to add are two super important parts. You have already touched on how much do we learn about society at hand when we read it through the stigma, which is of course one of the major contributions of queer studies. And since I have noticed that in the audience we have some eminent historians and activists of queer history, read the book. Dr. Kranebitter also touches on queerness of the so-called criminal prisoners who were sent, and that is something seen as biologically wrong with these people. And another thing worth mentioning here is we are building here on Nikolaus Wachsmann, who pointed out some 20 years ago that whatever these people committed, whether they forgot to pay the taxes or whether they sexually assaulted minors, which does not mean that I'm saying it's okay to sexually assault children, but nobody deserves to be sent to the camps. And this is still a hard truth to digest, and I think we need to look at it. Andy, you have some very powerful case studies in your book. Could you introduce one briefly, please?
I will, and I want to add to what you said, of course, a very, very important point, and this is why I share the screen again, but just for a short time. This, I hope you can see the next slide, which is, of course, one kind of this Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back myth of 1918, showing also what you just said, that it's also very important to state the intersectionality here. So, of course, the enemy was constructed not only as a criminal, but he was also attributed with Jewishness, with femaleness, with queerness. So the kind of enemy that was constructed in 1918 as a stab in the back myth was an intersectional myth. And it's important to see this link. Of course, it's a very specific and unique way of persecution for each group, but you also have to see the connection of it. So yeah, one of the stories, so I'm trying to start each chapter with a story, is one from the interwar period, because I think it shows pretty well what kind of deportees they were. In the interwar period, Wilhelm Engele was one of them from Western Austria. He was born in Innsbruck, and he drank a few too many quarters from time to time. So he didn't have a regular job and lived off selling objects that he had stolen, cutlery from pubs, winter coats, alarm clocks, and pocket watches. So altogether, he had 22 previous convictions. It was well known. It is very important to the Innsbruck police. So when he once appeared in court in 1937, which is still in Austria the time of Austro-fascism, it's not National Socialism, it's important to keep in mind. He had also previously stolen his landlady's watch, which he wanted to sell after the trial. And this is something that made the court and the authorities in Austria even more infuriated, because it proved in their view that he was incorrigible, that he would steal and go on with this and belie the punitive purpose and the principle of specific deterrence, because prison did not deter him. So this kind of rebelliousness against authorities also is something that showed the authorities their own powerlessness, and it's very important because with everyday historian Alf Lüdtke, I promised I just mentioned one name, Michel Foucault, but Alf Lüdtke is also very important for me. You can label this as Eigensinn or stubbornness, and this is very important to have as a concept when you're looking at those everyday practices. So Engele, after the Anschluss in Austria in March of 1938, and immediately the police was empowered to compile a list of people who are to be arrested and sent to a concentration camp. Engele was one of them, of those hundreds that were taken into custody in June of 1938. And deported to Dachau, and from there sent to the Mauthausen Concentration Camp, which was built in August of 1938 as the main concentration camp on Austrian soil. 6 months later, he was dead, allegedly died from cardiovascular insufficiency. He was one of the first who was killed there. He was number 5 in the death register that were compiled by the camp's doctor. About 90,000 people would be listed below him over the next 7 years. So what this case of Engele shows us is, firstly, that the absolute majority of those deported as professional criminals had previous convictions because of property crimes. So the Nazi newspapers showed the picture of violent crimes or sex crimes, but in fact, most of them, and I quantified it by finding a group of 146 people with the criminal records, 75% of their convictions were property crime, which is important because this is, of course, also connected to poverty and offenses against poverty laws. In Austria and Germany, you had huge and big laws on against vagrants and against the Vagabundengesetz. So people actually started from poverty here, and poverty was criminalized. This is in terms of class background. You can see that they were underprivileged working classes, lower classes, and actually the Nazi state waged a war against the underclass. Preventive custody was one of the main weapons against the underclass. This was the second point. The third one was the very, very important point that he was amtsbekannt in German, which is a word I didn't find in English. It means that you're well known to the police. The police knows you and it writes down, okay, it must be this and that. And actually, if you look at their offenses, at their previous offenses, in nearly 50% of the cases, 44%, there is at least one offense against the police or the authorities or the state in general, such as insulting an official or rioting or insurrection, which is important because it's not a coincidence. It was found by Patrick Wagner as well. It means that their actions were not only were taken as an offense against the state. It was criminal law was an politicization from above against this underclass. So this is the case study of Wilhelm Engele, and of course, I'm trying with this book not to just tell a story in an illustrative manner, but also, of course, to start each chapter with one biography.
Yeah, but I think this is also what makes your book so special and so humanistic, that you give the stories and fates and humanity to these people who have otherwise been written kind of through the view of the police, and the reader really gets a sense about who these people were, that they could be our uncle, it could be us, and you make a very powerful argument about understanding of the relationship between welfare state, or lack of welfare state, and the emergence of criminality. And that is, of course, a very important lesson also today, when we have the right-wing populism on the rising. I have a brief question about how you wrote the book. What struck me is your decision that when you discuss these individual stories, you often write quite closely to the sources, as opposed to the more Anglo-Saxon tradition of basically reading through all of it, trying to figure out what was the most probable thing that happened, or the best story to tell, and tell that. And I know you have put a lot of thought into writing. Why did you proceed this way?
It's really something like the main question of, can the subaltern speak? And of course, yeah, it can't. But you have to try to find archival material to unsilence those you write about. Especially in Germany and Austria, you have a long tradition of talking about them or not talking about them either, or of talking absolutely in a derogatory way. So I really wanted to find their voices in the archives. And of course, you have mainly only state and authority documents from the authorities, so police files, court files, and you don't really find true or real voices there. We know that. But nevertheless, it's very important to show both the derogatory language within the court files, because you find sentences that are really just violence in language and in words. And at the same time, also at least glimpses of their voices and citing them and telling them. I didn't want to retell the story only, but I really wanted to show their voices. And I do think that it does work if you dig close enough in the archives that you find sources where you can do this without being all too optimistic about this, of course. But there is this in German history or historiography, you would have the idea of not using those files because they would be in a perpetrator language, which is of course true in some way, but I don't think that you have to take over this perspective when you show this and when you break it by analyzing it right afterwards. So I'm trying to tell the story, as you said, linked closely to the files, but at the same time, I'm trying to also connect it to at least one theoretical point in one chapter or one methodological way of telling it. I don't know if this was successful. This is something that you have to judge.
It's a triumph, Andy. So you have now cited two historians, both of them men. We must have a historiography question. This is academic book series. So I wanted to invite you, if you could, again, briefly introduce the historiography about the so-called criminals and the social prisoners, and what is the intervention that you're doing. You already touched on basically putting the victims front and center. but we also, it would be worth if noting, now that you finished this book and it's such a rich book, where would you like the scholarship on the criminal prisoners to go in the future?
So there has been, of course, research on this done since the late 1980s, but only really in some exceptional cases, as we know, and I noted some of them. And also by some colleagues in the last years. We're also, of course, in close connection, and also, tried to put this on the agenda of the Bundestag in Germany, and also now changing the compensation laws in Austria. So, of course, there is a connection of those who worked on this, and there are not too many, so you can count them on two hands, I would guess. But actually, so what I focused on was, of course, for once, Austria and the Mauthausen concentration camp. And by this, I don't mean just the one concentration camp and just an Austrian perspective, but of course, Austrian history is very, very important for understanding the whole radicalization of the German Reich and the persecution policy. And after the Anschluss, we know that the anti-Semitic pogroms and all the different raids that were done in Vienna were a major part of the radicalization of total persecution policy. So focusing on Austria doesn't only mean focusing on Austria, but it is also a necessary part of understanding the whole story of National Socialism. But of course, it's also connected to a very specific Austrian problem then, like the Opferfürsorge, and not talking about victims or at all for a long time, or talking about them only in a negative way. So of course, this is a book based in Austria. At the same time, for me, it was important, as Dagmar Lieske has done, to have the focus on the biography and the biographies, and as well as a sociological point of view, so dealing with numbers, with statistics, not only some biographies, but really a collective biography, a prosopography, which also involves quantitative analysis. Of course, I don't think, of course, that research is ever done, as we know, and ever finished. But I do think that in very many ways, and we just had a big project on the criminal police and the police records in Austria, so they have just evolved. So even the police just finds their own files even though there is an archival law, but still there's much to be found. Other sources are only available right now, like the compensation claims files and so on. And there's the whole research on social outsiders from a social history point of view should be done. For example, Arbeitserziehungslager, the comparison also between different times and camps. So there's, it's in a way, it's just a started.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder, did you meet throughout your work any of the offspring of the people you researched or maybe wrote about, their children or grandchildren or nieces and nephews? How do they engage with their family history? Do they know this family history? Did they welcome your research? Could they contribute? How does that play out? Because it's a difficult legacy.
Absolutely. So this is one of the reasons why I started it at all. So as being responsible for research at the Mauthausen Memorial, you noticed, and I think this is the same in each former concentration camp memorial, that people and families with this family history are trying to find sources, trying to talk about their relatives that no one talked about, trying to make sense of this history because no one was really offering them a narrative. And so we noticed at the Mauthausen Memorial that those requests or inquiries were really going up in numbers. And I started to interview them. So some of them even wanted to visit the memorial, of course. They were often really just getting a kind of confirmation that, yes, your relative was deported to the Mauthausen concentration camp, with the category professional criminal. And then, of course, we always explained that this is not normal language, and this is not something that they should be taking all too serious. But of course, you can't explain it within a letter of just 1 or 2 pages. So many of them then asked, what does that mean? What does that even mean? I knew that my relative was in Mauthausen, but I never knew about this. So what is this? And then we also started to do an interview project with second and third generation family members. I did this with Maria von Laugers, a professor in Göttingen together, a sociologist. And this was very interesting for us because the experience of devaluation was running through the generations, of course, and was also something that many of them had to deal with. Just to give some examples, when the teacher tells the mother that as a daughter of a criminal, she should not ask any questions, or is not allowed to ask at all. When the husband says in an argument, "Think you daughter of a criminal, what do you want to tell me?" So, and this is always the end of the fight within a relationship. Or when a father labeled as a Berufsverbrecher before is not allowed to take part in his son's wedding ceremony because the other father of his of the bride was a former SS man, and even though the Berufsverbrecher had to pay for the wedding, he was not allowed there because he's a persona non grata. This also shows, of course, in a very small family issue who was running Austria in the post-war period. It was, of course, not the former dubious victims, but the former SS men. And in general, so there was no discourse, no narrative. So these interviews were very, in a way, exhausting also for us, because it was a kind of a negotiation about history within the interview itself, involving also me as a memorial worker, able to say if the relatives were victims or not. And of course, we said, as you mentioned before with Nick Waxtman, of course they were victims, and violence against crimes against criminals are crimes, and so on. But it's very hard for people to understand and to make sense of, because often, of course, family histories are also not that easy after 1945. With all those things that you mentioned, that they were neglected the status of being a victim of National Socialism at all in Austria.
Thank you. This was a very powerful answer, and I could not agree more that bringing light and bringing information and having an inclusive history can bring healing to the past generations, but also helps us understand and be better Democrats. I put into the link the association of the offspring of the so-called criminal and the social victims that is being run by Ines Eichmüller and Frank Nonnemacher. If anybody in the audience is interested in that, they also published recently an anthology of texts written by relatives of victims and survivors in German. We are coming to an end, and I have the last question. I promised to ask you a political question, and here it comes. Austria is just weeks before the next election. And I do wonder, how does your book and how does your work in this field reflect on the growing populism, both globally and in Austria? You are the director of the DÖF. You must have given it lots of thought. Please share your opinions with us.
Well, in a way, I would say that dealing with a question like this automatically brings you in opposition to right-wing extremists, which is not a big surprise, not only for the director of the DÖF, but for any kind of anti-fascist research, I would say. But there's two parts of this. The one is really revisionism, historical revisionism. So in a way, the only ones who were talking about those criminals in the concentration camps were right-wing extremists, for example. There was even a big case in 2016 also ending in court of a newspaper called Aula, which was published by the Freedom Party's academical branch. Of course, it was officially not connected to the Freedom Party. It's now not there anymore since 2018, but there is a lot of court things going on with this. So they were always mentioning that people were deported to concentration camps who had been criminals. And for them, this was a kind of easy way to say that concentration camps were not all that bad, because if they were criminals, then it was part of a normal way of a penitentiary system, which it was not. Of course, as I mentioned, but if there is no research saying, well, let's look at those who were labeled criminal, let's look at those closely, and let's see what the history of this is, right-wing extremism's discourse is alone in interpreting the history of the concentration camps and having a point in this, as they were the only ones mentioning this group. So this was very important for me also to really look into this and saying that this is not the case, and it's more complex than they say, of course, and totally different than they say. And the other thing is that, of course, it touches on the issue of something that in German you call Straflust in society, which is extra punitiveness as part of an authoritarianism. So people are afraid of criminality, and on the one hand, and on the other one, they want authorities to deal with it harshly. So this is this kind of extra punitiveness. And I, as the director of the DERF, so the DERF is not only doing historical research, but also research on right-wing extremism, something that the Freedom Party doesn't really like in Austria, but it's what we do and what we're here for.
That's shocking.
Yes, well, they are thinking that there is no right-wing extremism. So right-wing extremism is just invented by the Verfassungsschutz, the police, and by the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance. That's really what Herbert Kickl says in each interview.
Fake news.
They believe that, yeah. And so it's very easy for them also to make politics of fear, of this fear of criminality, and also of this extra punitiveness. So we included, so we're doing sociological research on right-wing extremism in Austrian society as well. And we included one question, for example, one question especially on so-called, on the same kind of preventive custody, and said that and had a question in the questionnaire: people who are dangerous should be locked up even before they commit a crime. And it's a total of 53% agreeing with this. So this is part of something that you can see, that I don't know if the numbers would be similar in other countries, but of course it shows that there is a huge proportion really agreeing to this kind of preventive custody. And it's easy for right-wing extremists and right-wing populists to stand on that and to connect it with migration issues, with asylum issues, with racism, and you can do easy politics of hatred. And for me, so this part of this book is to really show where a tough and harsh law and order policy can lead to, and that something like a preventive custody cannot be discussed in a democracy, especially when you are a country like Austria and Germany with a history of something like this ending up in concentration camps.
You were very patient in my many questions. I think now the audience has many other questions.
Yes, so before I turn to, we are getting a few questions coming in. I just want to abuse my my role here as the moderator. If I could pose a question in relation to your book. There is this idea that prisoner functionaries such as capos and Lagerälteste came from this so-called Berufsverbrechern class, this professional criminal class. So can you clarify this and discuss maybe where this concept comes from, and what is the nexus between the functionaries and these so-called habitual criminals?
Mm-hmm. So, of course, part of this is true, because prisoner functionaries and capos were coming from all different kinds of deportees. But of course, the main point is that not all so-called professional criminals were prisoner functionaries, and not all prisoner functionaries were professional criminals. So the connection is not that easy altogether. It was like, I would say for Mauthausen, it's like 10% being in a position like a capo, prisoner functionary, and of course not all of them misused or abused this power. So when you look through the reports of survivors, you will always come across the same names mainly. And then I also made part of this research project was really to focus on some of these names and to dive into their stories. One of them I also have in the book in this chapter on prisoner functionaries. Franz Unig, someone who really is always mentioned in reports. And in his case, you see that he was labeled as a professional criminal, but at the same time, he has a medical story of syphilis in the last stages, which is, if you look at the history of this is really a serious medical issue. At the same time, you find that he was member of the NSDAP early on. So he was convicted, or he was deported to Mauthausen as a professional criminal, but he also had a history, a medical history, and a history of political history of being a Nazi himself. And so for me, the important thing by this is that nobody knew this history, nobody looked into this history. And this is very important because this is something that the SS made invisible, because they perfectly knew this story. And they chose him for this, to be the camp eldest. But of course, if you eradicate this story after 1945, you can blame the whole group of those with the green triangle, that they would be all the same, and they would be all capos. And also for me, the most important thing is that looking into the biographies of quite many capos, it's not a normal case that you have someone like Franz Uneg. The normal case would be someone who the concentration camp really shapes as a capo and makes a capo. And this is not at all, or not that much, connected to the previous story and the previous biography, but really something that comes up in the concentration camp. It is produced by the concentration camp and by the SS. This is the most important thing, regardless of the triangle that he or she wore. And for me, sorry, I want to add one more thing, just which is very important, because if you look at Austrian post-war history, you see that it was capos and prisoner functionaries sentenced by court for crimes against humanity and for Nazi crimes, and not former SS men. So if you look at the numbers, Linz, for example, which is a very big district, there were 6,000 defendants. 2,000 of them were sentenced. 3 of them were sentenced to death, and only one was really executed. And this was Johann Ludwig. He was 30 years old. He was a capo in Gusen, a professional criminal, and also, according to the Nuremberg laws, half Jewish. And this is, of course, no coincidence, because crimes in concentration camps were blamed on the victims after 1945 in Austrian courts. And I don't think that the German situation is much different. And it was the same if you look at the Auschwitz files in Austria. It's the same story. So Berufsverbrechern and professional criminals were the perfect projection screen for Nazis reintegrating into society in Austria and Germany.
Thank you. That was very full and well stated. Thanks, Andreas. So we have another question from Christiana. How is gender reflected in your research? And did you come across women's stories that fell into this category, this class of prisoners as well?
Thank you so much, and sorry for not mentioning this. So the main point why I didn't talk about it is that we're talking about Mauthausen. And in Mauthausen, which was a very male concentration camp, it was 180,000 male prisoners and about 6,000 female prisoners. So I didn't come in my research across very many stories. Actually, it was just one I published on this story also, because it's the mother of Josef Fritzl, but it's a very complicated biography and story. So it's not easy to make sense of this. But other than that, Mauthausen is not really a part of this story. I made research with Brigitte Halbmeier also about the criminal police in Graz, and you see there that there was a clear masculinist way of policing, that the label of professional criminal was mostly applied to men. And only to women when they were connected to offenses against, like abortion offenses, because of course this was the Nazi part of crimes against the Volkskörper, if you want. But actually it was mostly used against men, and women were mostly labeled as antisocial in the same Erlass. In the practice. So you see that this is quite androcentrist by the Nazi state, and used androcentrist. But the most important thing, of course, why queerness and also why thinking about sex and gender is important, is for me that you have to use the sources in a way that Anna also mentioned in her book, as queering the sources or as making visible those stories. So yeah, those people without, what is the English translation? Without a history are dust.
People without history are dust.
Okay, sorry, I'm just always know determined.
Christina, can I squeeze in a question, or do you have lots and lots?
There's a couple more, but please feel free. Yeah.
Well, why don't you post the others?
No,
and then...
okay. It's okay. It's okay. If it is, go ahead.
Well, so I am a sucker for quantitative history, and of course you are a historical sociologist. And what I know how much work is behind that, you have some very poignant statistics about who are the criminals who are in Mauthausen. How do they compare in terms of class to the SS headquarters, and how do they compare to the political prisoners? And that was very eye-opening for me. So if you could share also with the audience, please.
Yes, that was very important for me. Also, of course, also to in a way control what you read in the sources, because also often our impressions are wrong when reading just a court file or a police file, and we're led to some conclusions that are not really quantifiable. So for me, it's very important to focus on this. So I focused on this group of 885 Austrian professional criminals, and 146 of them, I really found more documents and could reconstruct the criminal records before that. So you can see how many previous convictions they had in the mean, and you can see what class they came from. And as you said, so they were absolutely so it was confirmed in quantitative, in statistical terms, what you had as an impression. It was really a war, a class war, if you so wish, against the lower classes in National Socialism. So this is something you see perfectly in these different ways of putting it in statistical terms. The group of so-called anti-socials and professional criminals were absolutely from the lowest strata of society compared to the mean, the Society of National Socialism, where you have numbers from statistical records and from the Volkszählung and from polls.
I think, is this the statistics?
This is it, yeah. So you see the overrepresentation, and so there's Austria in 1934 compared to all Austrian prisoners, where you see that Austrian prisoners are more or less a perfect representation, if you so wish, of Austria in 1934. And then you see that the SS in the camp, where I did the same with a colleague, with Gregor Holzinger, is there's the upper stratum much overrepresented, so it's 262 to 100, and the lower class, of course, underrepresented, which is important for us because, as we know, after 1945, Konrad Adenauer coined the term that the SS was actually made from the lower strata and from all those proletarians and those anti-socials. In fact, it was, of course, a very academic core of the SS, facing.
Yeah, I think this is what we need.
Society.
Here is the comparison of the criminals with the politicals of the Jewish prisoners, and yes, what that is. And yes. I mean, many in the audience will know, but this is months and months and months of collecting data, of cleaning data. Because, people do not come to Mauthausen with like a holy red card that says I'm upper lower class.
No, they don't. So, but this is what sociologists do.
Yeah, but not all of them quite as beautiful as you. I've seen a lot of quantitative projects about the Holocaust, and you were always, for me, the golden standard. Okay, I will stop squeezing myself into questions.
Okay, so let's turn to a question from Sarah. Thanking you and looking forward to reading your book. And she said she might have a very specific question. I was wondering if you have come across a National Socialist category of so-called international crime or international criminals at some point. For Sarah's own research, she's very much interested in all sorts of trafficking. And since the Reichskriminalpolizeiamt had different centers, some of them focusing on international pickpockets or trafficking in women, she would be curious to know if this had any significance for practical policing. And sort of related to that was a question about the policing and persecution of criminals in the occupied countries after the outbreak of World War II and their deportation.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a very interesting question. So it's not that I came across this very often, but there is in this research projects I just mentioned, a lot of files came up in Tyrol, in Innsbruck, where you have this kind of policy where you see, and this is the same in Elsass-Lothringen, where you see that after the occupation of Elsass-Lothringen and also after the so-called Anschluss in Austria, Nazi criminal police had to think about how to deal with criminals, with Austrian or German criminals in South Tyrol or in Italy altogether, and how to deal with prisoners in France and in the occupied zone of France and in the Vichy France. And in both cases, interestingly enough, they decided to ask Italy and Vichy France to hand over criminals from prisons, so that they could make the decision of imprisoning them further or releasing them or sending them to a concentration camp. And so it was really done that they were so that they even asked Italy, for example, to send to Innsbruck all German prisoners within Italian prisons. And very many of them were then sent to death in concentration camps. So the kind of bureaucratic procedure to really get a hold of those imprisoned somewhere on the continent of Europe and in the occupied countries was very strong. So they actually decided for this, but this was always, and this is the main point, not so much focusing on non-Germans, but on Germans in different countries. So this was always like building the German Volkskörper, the Volksgemeinschaft, the German people, and not so much on international crime itself. But this is a very important topic, very interesting. Would be looking forward to reading something about this. I want to write it.
Thanks. And there is another question from Aisling. This is going back to the point that you made about the oral histories and the kind of family research questions that you'd get. Aisling's asking if any of the prisoners who were labeled as so-called habitual criminals spoke about their prisoner categorization to their relatives, and how open was this conversation?
Also very good question. So it's very different. So most of them didn't talk about it because it was connected to shame. Many of them didn't talk about anything. Many families just told us that they would just discover something, like they were in prison or a concentration camp. Also, they were left alone with their fantasies. So some of them told us that there must be some kind of Auschwitz history because there is a tattoo. Actually, the tattoo was not an Auschwitz tattoo, but a tattoo done in prisons in the 1920s and 30s, but it was also hidden there. So many didn't talk about their stories. Some of them did. So there were some cases where even, so this is part of the story where I don't really believe this story that nobody talked about this, because this is always a bit of a classist view on those victims, because they could write, they could talk, and they did do so. And they wrote lengthy letters to the compensation agencies, and they wrote lengthy letters to the families, and wrote diaries, and they drew some things about the concentration camp, and they even gave interviews. So one of them was very important because they were the only ones telling the story of Mauthausen, for example, in the first year of its existence. And nobody else, who would you ask about Mauthausen in 1938? There is no other possibility than that. But in general, I would say, yeah, it's true that at least they weren't listened to, and within the families, I think this was not a very easy connections. But actually, I only know So this oral history project was a biographical narrative project focusing on the biographies also of those interviewed. So it's 15 interviews. I can't say a lot about it. There's very much more research to be done.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question from Florian. Are the persecuted in Mauthausen buried at their former hometowns? And are there records of these people in local cemetery administrations? And asking the question not only about so-called criminals, but other groups from Mauthausen, I think.
A very good question. This depends, of course, on the point in time. So in the first years, yes, and people were in 1938 and 1939. There was even a connection that families, some families, were visiting the camp, but this was of course not very often. In later years, the ashes of those were sent to the families, and also during National Socialism, buried in the cemeteries of the different cities and towns, small towns as well. And of course, it's the same as in all the other cases. After some point of time, that it's not in any way the individual ash of anyone. Also the ashes of people were then sent, just buried in cemeteries like Steyr and Linz, without giving any notice to the relatives as well. So this is also connected to the fate of all Austrian groups as well. So this is, but it's a good question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to this in detail, but I would say it depends on the point in time.
And then finally, a more practical one, the oral history interviews, are they available to access?
So Maria and I wrote some articles about it, and it's not in all cases. So some of those we interviewed agreed that the interviews were handed over to the Mauthausen Memorial. Some of them didn't want to have their interview stored in an archive. This is also something, of course, we respect that. And some of these interviews were, should not be publicly available, and others were. So we left this, of course, to the interviewed. It's their decision what happens to their story. And they agreed that we would publish about it, but they didn't in all. So it's different choices they made about the archive. But if so, we had a collection started at the Mauthausen Memorial. So some of those interviews can be listened there.
Okay, thank you. Anna, did you have any closing thoughts that you wanted to share before I officially close out the event?
Read the book, download it, put it on your syllabus.
Exactly.
And thank you so much.
And invite Dr. Kranebitter for more book talks.
Yes.
I would love to come to London. It would have been nice to do it there, but it's great to do it this way. And thank you so much for the invitation.
Your app is slightly flooded.
Yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us, and thank you, Anna, for chairing the event. And of course, thank you to everybody who joined us tonight for tonight's event, and for all of your questions and comments. There's lots of applause going on and comments coming in about how much they enjoyed the event. The event has been recorded, and we will be putting it on YouTube in case you've missed any of it. And yes, please do feel free to check out our website for our next events in our series. So thank you again, Anna and Andreas, and wishing you a good evening and a good afternoon, and everybody else a good evening as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.